You're crouched in complete darkness, your heart hammering against your ribs as foreign voices echo through concrete corridors just 20 feet away. Your phone buzzes against your chest, a call you can't answer because even the slightest sound could cost you everything. When you finally see the screen 2 hours later, the missed call notification makes your blood run cold. St. Mary's Hospital, emergency. Your daughter needs blood. Your mother refuses to come, and you're trapped in a mission that could change everything or destroy it all. This is the story of how one phone call in the middle of a covert operation revealed the deepest truth about family, sacrifice, and what it really means to save the people you love.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Natasha Snow had always been different from other mothers. While her neighbors in suburban Phoenix drove minivans to soccer practice, she drove a nondescript Honda Civic to classified briefings. While they worried about PTA meetings, she worried about international security threats. At 28, she was one of the youngest operatives ever recruited into the Defense Intelligence Agency's Special Operations Division. And she wore that distinction like invisible armor. But on that Tuesday morning in March, as she braided her 7-year-old daughter Emma's honey blonde hair before school, Natasha felt like any other mother in America. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon toast and coffee. Cartoon voices chattered from the living room TV. Emma's backpack lay open on the counter, stuffed with homework folders and a permission slip for the upcoming field trip to the Science Museum. "Mommy, will you be able to come to my presentation on Friday?" Emma asked, her green eyes, so much like Natasha's own, bright with hope. "I'm doing it on butterflies, and I made this really cool poster with all the different types." Natasha's chest tightened. She'd missed the last 3 school events because of emergency deployments. Each absence felt like a small betrayal, a choice between the daughter she could see and touch and the thousands of children she protected through her work, children who would never know her name or face. "I'm going to try my absolute hardest to be their sweetheart," she said, fastening the elastic around Emma's braid. It wasn't a promise, and they both knew it. Emma's smile dimmed just slightly, a reaction she'd learned to hide but couldn't quite master yet. After dropping Emma at Sunset Elementary, Natasha drove across Phoenix to a building that didn't exist on any public records. The DIA's Western Operations Center looked like just another glass office complex, complete with a fake corporate sign reading Meridian Consulting Services. But beneath its mundane exterior lay one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations in the country. Her supervisor, Agent Marcus Rodriguez, was waiting in Conference Room C with an expression that meant only one thing: big assignment, high stakes, no room for error. "Snow, we've got a situation developing in Eastern Europe that requires immediate attention," he said, sliding a classified folder across the polished table. "There's been chatter about a weapons trafficking network operating out of Romania. We've identified a key handoff happening this week, and we need eyes on the ground." Natasha opened the folder, scanning the intelligence reports and surveillance photos. Her mind immediately shifted into operational mode, analyzing routes, timing, potential complications. This was what she'd trained for. The reason she had spent 2 years learning Romanian and another year studying Eastern European criminal networks. "Timeline?" she asked. "Wheels up in 6 hours. You'll be inserted near Bucharest tomorrow night. The operation window is narrow, 72 hours, maybe less." 72 hours? Emma's butterfly presentation was in 4 days. "I understand," she said, already calculating how to arrange childcare with Mrs. Patterson next door, how to explain another sudden work trip to Emma, how to pack for an operation that could stretch far beyond its projected timeline. But on that Tuesday morning in March, as Marcus leaned forward with an expression she'd never seen before, something almost like sympathy. "There's something else, Snow. The intel suggests this isn't just about weapons. We think this network is connected to a larger human trafficking operation.
Specifically, he paused, his voice dropping. Children. The words hit Natasha like a physical blow. Suddenly, this wasn't just another mission. Every detail in the folder, the warehouse locations, the coded communications, the shipping manifests, took on a horrifying new dimension. Somewhere in Romania, children Emma's age were being treated as cargo.
The choice between her two worlds had never been starker or more important. Growing up in rural Montana, Natasha had learned early that sometimes the right choice was also the hardest one. Her father, a Vietnam veteran turned high school principal, had taught her that strength wasn't about avoiding difficult decisions. It was about making them, even when they cost you everything you wanted to keep. Her mother, Linda Snow, had taught her something different. Linda believed that a woman's first responsibility was always to her family, that career ambitions were luxuries that came second to the people who needed you most. When Natasha had joined the military at 18, Linda had called it selfish. When she'd been recruited by the DIA, Linda had refused to speak to her for 3 months. "You're going to lose everything that matters chasing after things that don't," Linda had said during their last real conversation 2 years ago. That little girl needs her mother more than the world needs another soldier. Now, sitting in that sterile conference room with photos of Romanian warehouses spread before her, Natasha understood that her mother's words had been both wrong and prophetic. Emma did need her mother, but so did the children in those grainy surveillance photos, the ones whose faces she couldn't see, but whose desperation she could feel across an ocean. The training kicked in as she memorized operational details. Cover identity, Sarah Mitchell. Freelance photographer working on a travel piece about post-communist architecture. Entry point, Bucharest Henri Coanda International Airport. Local contact, Agent Dmitry Volkov, embedded in the Romanian police force for the past 18 months. But beneath the professional focus, a deeper current ran through her thoughts. This mission felt different from all the others, not just because of what was at stake, but because of what it might cost her personally. The trafficking network they were tracking had tentacles reaching into multiple countries, connections that could take months to fully unravel. 72 hours could easily become 72 days. As she prepared to leave the briefing, Marcus handed her a secure satellite phone. "Family emergency protocol is standard," he said. "But Snow, this one's important. Don't take any unnecessary risks." She nodded, but they both knew that in their line of work, necessity was often a matter of perspective. What seemed unnecessary from a conference room in Phoenix might be the difference between stopping a criminal network and letting it slip away. That evening, as she tucked Emma into bed, Natasha found herself memorizing details she usually took for granted. The way Emma's hair smelled like strawberry shampoo, the collection of stuffed animals arranged with military precision on her nightstand, the small scar on her chin from a playground accident the previous summer. An accident that had happened while Natasha was in a briefing about border security, unreachable and unaware until hours later. "Will you bring me something back from your travel trip?" Emma asked, her voice already drowsy. "What would you like?" Natasha asked, smoothing the covers around her daughter's small frame. "Just come back soon, okay?" It was such a simple request, and yet Natasha found herself unable to promise it. Instead, she kissed Emma's forehead and whispered, "I love you more than all the stars in the sky." As she stood in the doorway watching Emma sleep, Natasha Snow made a decision that would change everything. This mission wouldn't just be about gathering intelligence or disrupting a criminal network. It would be about proving, to herself, to Emma, and maybe even to her mother, that she could save the world and still come home to the people who needed her most. She had no way of knowing that in less than 48 hours, that phone call would come in the middle of the most dangerous moment of her career, forcing her to choose between the mission that could save dozens of children and the crisis that threatened her own. The spark was lit. The real test was still to come. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The wheels of the military transport touched down at Ramstein Air Base in Germany at 03:47 hours, 36 hours after Natasha had kissed Emma goodbye. The massive aircraft hangar buzzed with controlled chaos. Personnel loading equipment, pilots running pre-flight checks, and intelligence officers hunched over laptops receiving last-minute updates from Washington. Natasha moved through the organized mayhem with practiced efficiency, her photographer's equipment case concealing state-of-the-art surveillance gear. The Sarah Mitchell cover identity felt comfortable now, like slipping into familiar clothes. She'd spent the flight memorizing architectural photography terminology and studying Romanian tourism websites, transforming herself into someone whose biggest concern was finding the perfect light for a cathedral shot. Colonel James Wright, the mission coordinator, intercepted her near the departure gate for the civilian flight to Bucharest. His weathered face carried the weight of 3 decades in special operations, and his eyes held the kind of gravity that meant new intelligence had arrived. "Snow, we've got updates from our asset in Romania," he said, handing her a tablet with encrypted messages. "The trafficking network is bigger than we initially assessed. Our Romanian contact, Agent Volkov, has identified at least 3 separate facilities where children are being held pending transport." The information on the screen made Natasha's stomach clench. Warehouse locations on the outskirts of Bucharest, safe houses in residential neighborhoods, a shipping facility near the port of Constanța. Each location represented dozens of young lives hanging in the balance. "The handoff we're tracking isn't just a weapons deal," Wright continued. "It's the final stage of a pipeline that's been operating for at least 2 years. If we miss this window, these children disappear into Western Europe and we lose any chance of getting them back." Natasha studied the facility layouts, automatically calculating approach routes and security vulnerabilities. But underneath the tactical analysis, a different calculation was running through her mind. Emma would be waking up in about 4 hours, probably wondering if her mother had made it safely to wherever she was going. Mrs. Patterson would give her breakfast and walk her to school, maintaining the routine that kept Emma's world stable even when Natasha's was anything but. "Time sensitivity?" she asked. "The main handoff happens tomorrow night at 2200 hours, but here's where it gets complicated. Intelligence suggests there are backup plans in place. If the primary operation gets compromised, the entire network goes underground. We might be looking at a one-shot opportunity." One shot. No second chances. No room for error. As Natasha boarded the commercial flight to Bucharest, she carried with her more than just surveillance equipment and cover documentation. She carried the weight of a decision that had already begun to change her. For the first time in her career, she wasn't just following orders or completing an assignment. She was stepping into something that felt like destiny. The businessman in the seat next to her struck up a conversation during takeoff, clearly hoping to pass the time with what he assumed was an attractive tourist. Sarah Mitchell smiled politely and discussed her interest in post-communist architecture, but Natasha Snow was already 3 moves ahead, visualizing how she would navigate Bucharest's streets, make contact with Agent Volkov, and position herself for surveillance without arousing suspicion. This was the leap she'd been training for her entire career, not just physically crossing into hostile territory, but mentally crossing into a space where failure meant more than mission compromise or career damage. It meant children would continue to disappear, families would never find their loved ones, and the network would adapt and evolve, becoming even harder to track. Bucharest's Henry Cohen International Airport felt like a time capsule, mixing Soviet-era architecture with modern European efficiency. As Sarah Mitchell, Natasha cleared customs with ease, her photographer credentials and tourism documentation passing every inspection. But as she stepped into the arrivals hall, scanning for her prearranged signal, she felt the familiar electricity of entering operational territory. Agent Dmitry Volkov wasn't what she'd expected. Instead of the grizzled veteran she'd imagined, he appeared to be in his early 30s, dressed like a university professor in worn corduroy jacket and wire-rimmed glasses. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm Professor Antonescu from the University of Bucharest. Welcome to Romania. I trust your flight was comfortable." As they walked through the airport, he briefed her under the guise of discussing architectural sites.
The trafficking network operated primarily at night, using a series of legitimate businesses as fronts. A construction company that moved equipment after dark, a restaurant that stayed open unusually late and had frequent deliveries, a shipping firm with contracts that didn't match their visible operations.
The children are moved in small groups, Volkov explained as they climbed into his university vehicle. Never more than 4 or 5 at a time. They use routes that change weekly, but tomorrow night's handoff is different. Intelligence suggests they're moving their entire current inventory, approximately 30 children aged 6 to 14. 30 children. Natasha's hands clenched involuntarily as she thought about Emma, safe in her Phoenix classroom but the same age as some of these victims. Their first stop was a modest hotel in Bucharest's Old Town, chosen specifically because it sat at the intersection of 3 different escape routes and offered clear sightlines to 2 of the suspected facilities. As Sarah Mitchell, Natasha checked in with enthusiasm about exploring the city's architecture. As Natasha Snow, she was already identifying every security camera, every potential surveillance position, every way in and out of the building. The hotel room became her command center. Tourist brochures spread across the desk concealed detailed maps of the trafficking network's territory. A professional camera with telephoto lens would serve dual purposes, maintaining her cover while providing surveillance capability. Most importantly, the room's corner window offered a direct view of the warehouse district where tomorrow night's operation would unfold. That evening, as Sarah Mitchell enjoyed dinner at a traditional Romanian restaurant, Natasha Snow was conducting reconnaissance. Every conversation overheard, every person observed, every vehicle that passed by the window became part of a growing tactical picture. The traffickers had been operating in this area for months, long enough to establish patterns, but not long enough to become complacent. The breakthrough came during dessert. A man at a nearby table took a phone call that lasted exactly 90 seconds, short enough to avoid electronic surveillance, but long enough to confirm details. When he left the restaurant, Natasha noticed his car, a dark sedan with commercial plates that matched one of the vehicles in their intelligence reports. Following him required abandoning her meal and her cover story about being a tired tourist ready to return to her hotel. Instead, she became someone else entirely, a local resident walking home from dinner, comfortable enough with the streets to navigate them confidently, but observant enough to track a target without being noticed. The sedan led her through Bucharest's quieter districts to a neighborhood that didn't appear on any tourist maps. Residential buildings mixed with small businesses, creating the perfect environment for operations that needed to blend into ordinary life. When the car stopped outside a children's clothing store that was closed for the evening, Natasha knew she'd found one of their facilities. The store's upstairs windows showed faint light, not the harsh fluorescence of security lighting, but the softer glow of occupied space. As she positioned herself across the street, using a bus stop as cover, she observed subtle signs that confirmed her suspicions. Reinforced locks on what should have been a simple retail entrance, windows that had been covered from the inside with material thick enough to block all visibility. Most telling of all, the building's rear exit led directly to an alley that connected with the main route to the warehouse district. This was more than reconnaissance now. This was the moment when theoretical planning became operational reality. Tomorrow night, children would be moved from this building to that warehouse, then loaded into vehicles bound for destinations across Europe. Unless she and Volkov could document the entire network and coordinate with Romanian authorities to execute simultaneous raids on every facility. As she walked back to her hotel, Natasha felt the weight of what she'd committed to. This wasn't just about gathering intelligence anymore. She was deep inside a criminal operation with tentacles reaching into multiple countries, protected by corruption and violence, and sophisticated enough to have avoided detection for years. But for the first time since accepting this mission, she felt something she hadn't expected: certainty. Not about the tactical challenges ahead or the personal costs that might be required, but about the fundamental rightness of what she was doing. Somewhere in that clothing store, children were waiting for someone to find them. In her hotel room, she had the tools and training to make that happen. The leap was complete. Tomorrow would test everything she'd learned about being both Natasha Snow and Sarah Mitchell, about protecting the innocent and serving something larger than herself. Tonight, she fell asleep planning how to save 30 children she'd never met, while thousands of miles away,
Emma slept peacefully, trusting that her mother would always find a way to come home.
Dawn in Bucharest brought an unseasonable chill and the first real complications of what Natasha had assumed would be a straightforward surveillance operation. She woke to 17 missed calls on her secure satellite phone, all from Agent Volkov, all made between 0400 and 0600 hours, when she should have been monitoring communication channels instead of sleeping. The voice message was brief, but devastating. "Sarah, we have a problem. The timeline has accelerated. They're moving the children tonight, not tomorrow. Meet me at the Chusmidju Gardens Cafe in 30 minutes. Come alone." As she dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, Natasha's mind raced through the implications. Every aspect of their operational plan had been built around having another full day for preparation. Surveillance routes to map, backup communication systems to establish, Romanian police units to coordinate with. Most critically, time to identify all the facilities in the network so they could execute simultaneous raids instead of watching the traffickers scatter like roaches when the first location was hit. The Chusmidju Gardens at sunrise were beautiful in a way that felt almost insulting given the circumstances. Early joggers traced paths around the lake, while elderly men fed ducks from park benches. Agent Volkov sat at an outdoor cafe table, his professor disguise still intact, but his eyes carrying the kind of exhaustion that came from a night of emergency intelligence gathering. "The intercepts started coming in at 0300, he said, without preamble, sliding a tablet across the table disguised as sharing tourist photos. Someone spooked them. Maybe a rival network, maybe law enforcement activity they caught wind of. Either way, they've moved up their entire schedule." The intelligence reports painted a picture of controlled panic within the trafficking organization. Emergency meetings, route changes, most ominously, references to cleaning house and eliminating loose ends. Terminology that, in this context, could mean anything from destroying evidence to eliminating witnesses. "How much time do we have?" Natasha asked, studying the intercepted communications while maintaining her Sarah Mitchell persona for any casual observers. "Best estimate, 12 hours. The handoff begins at sunset, not midnight as originally planned. But here's the real problem. They've changed the location." The new intelligence showed a completely different operational theater. Instead of the warehouse district she'd spent yesterday evening studying, the traffickers had moved their operation to the industrial port area near the Dębowica River. Larger buildings, more complex security, and most dangerously, multiple escape routes that included river access. "There's something else," Volkov continued, his voice dropping even lower. "The network is bigger than we thought. Yesterday's reconnaissance at the clothing store was solid intelligence, but it's just one spoke of a much larger wheel. We've identified 7 separate holding facilities, not 3. The children aren't being moved from single locations, they're being consolidated from multiple sites simultaneously." 7 facilities, potentially more children than the 30 they'd originally estimated. And now they had less than half the time they'd planned for, in completely unfamiliar territory with a criminal organization that had clearly been alerted to some kind of threat. As if the tactical challenges weren't overwhelming enough, Natasha's personal complications began cascading almost immediately. Her secure phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Patterson in Phoenix. "Emma asking lots of questions about your trip. When should I tell her to expect you back?" The simple question hit harder than any operational briefing. Emma's butterfly presentation was in 3 days. Under the original timeline, Natasha would have been cutting it close, but could potentially make it back. Now, with the mission parameters completely changed and the criminal network potentially scattering across multiple countries, there was no way to predict when she'd be able to leave Romania. "I need to contact my handler," she told Volkov. "This level of operational change requires approval from command." But when she reached Colonel Wright on the encrypted satellite link, his response was exactly what she had feared and expected. "Snow, I understand the personal implications, but this might be our only shot at this network. Intelligence suggests they're planning to go completely underground after this operation. If we lose them now, those children disappear permanently." The weight of that statement settled over her like a physical presence. Somewhere in Bucharest, children were being prepared for transport to destinations unknown. Some would disappear into forced labor, others into situations she didn't want to imagine. All of them would lose their identities, their families, their futures, unless she and Volkov could somehow document enough of the network to enable coordinated international action. But the technical challenges were mounting by the hour. The port area where the new handoff would occur was a maze of warehouses, shipping containers, and industrial equipment that provided countless hiding places, but also countless opportunities for ambush. Unlike the residential neighborhood she'd studied, this was territory controlled entirely by commercial interests that could easily be compromised or corrupted. Worse, the accelerated timeline meant they couldn't wait for backup or additional resources. The Romanian police units that Volkov had been cultivating as potential allies weren't ready for immediate action. The surveillance equipment she'd brought was designed for urban surveillance, not industrial reconnaissance. Most critically, they now needed to track multiple simultaneous operations instead of focusing on a single handoff point. By midday, the scope of what they were attempting had become clear, and it was staggering. Using tourist photography as cover, Natasha spent the afternoon conducting reconnaissance of the port area, identifying 7 different routes that traffickers might use and 4 potential staging areas where children could be held during the consolidation process. Each location presented unique challenges. Warehouse Complex A had excellent concealment opportunities, but was surrounded by open ground that made approach difficult. Shipping Terminal B offered multiple escape routes, but was brightly lit and heavily monitored by security cameras. The marina facilities provided water access for quick escape, but were patrolled regularly by Port Authority personnel. As she documented each site, Natasha found herself thinking not just tactically, but emotionally. Every shipping container could be hiding frightened children. Every warehouse could be the last place they'd be seen before disappearing forever. The weight of that possibility made every photograph she took feel like a race against time. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While photographing what appeared to be abandoned shipping equipment, she noticed movement in a warehouse that supposedly hadn't been in use for months. Not the random activity of squatters or urban explorers, but the purposeful movement of people who were trying not to be seen. Using her camera's telephoto capabilities, she documented what appeared to be a rehearsal. Men in dark clothing practicing coordination movements. Vehicles being positioned and repositioned. Most tellingly, the testing of communication equipment, hand signals, and radio checks that suggested a complex operation requiring precise timing. This wasn't just a criminal transaction. It was a military-style operation involving dozens of people, multiple vehicles, and coordination across several facilities simultaneously. The traffickers weren't just moving children, they were executing a logistics operation that would have impressed professional military planners. By late afternoon, as shadows lengthened across the port district, Natasha realized that she and Volkov were facing something far beyond what either of them had trained for. They weren't just gathering intelligence on a criminal network, they were preparing to infiltrate what amounted to a small army that had been planning this operation for weeks or months. The final complication arrived as she was returning to her hotel. A text message on her personal phone, not the secure satellite link, but her regular number that only family and close friends had access to. It was from her mother, Linda, in Montana. Called to check on Emma. Patricia Patterson says you're traveling for work again. That little girl needs stability, not a mother who's never home. The message felt like a knife twist, not because it was cruel, but because it might be true. Here she was, thousands of miles from Emma, preparing for an operation that could extend indefinitely, while her daughter waited for a mother who might not make it to her school presentation and might not even make it home at all. As sunset approached and the final phase of preparation began, Natasha Snow faced the hardest realization of her career.
Sometimes the right thing to do and the possible thing to do weren't the same thing. Tonight would determine whether she was capable of bridging that gap or whether the gap would swallow everything she cared about most. The reality check was complete. The real test was about to begin, and for the first time in her professional life, Natasha wasn't sure she was ready for what it might cost.
The abandoned grain elevator on the eastern edge of Bucharest's port district had been rotting for 15 years, but to Natasha, it represented the perfect solution to an impossible problem. At 7 stories tall, with windows facing every direction, it offered surveillance capability across the entire operational theater. More importantly, its decrepit state meant no security, no legitimate business activity, and no reason for anyone to look twice at a photographer documenting urban decay for an architectural magazine. Getting inside required skills she hadn't used since her army days: lockpicking, structural assessment, and the kind of improvised climbing that turned rusty fire escapes into viable access routes. But as she hauled her equipment to the 5th floor and began setting up surveillance positions, Natasha felt something she hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of solving complex problems with nothing but intelligence, creativity, and determination. The view from the grain elevator revealed the true scope of what the trafficking network had built: 7 different facilities spread across a 2-mile radius, connected by a web of roads that allowed rapid movement between sites while maintaining operational security. From her elevated position, she could see patterns that had been invisible from ground level: the timing of vehicle movements, the coordination between different locations, the sophisticated communication system that kept the entire operation synchronized. Agent Volkov arrived at the grain elevator just as the afternoon light began its golden transformation toward evening. He'd spent the day conducting his own reconnaissance, and his findings filled in crucial gaps in their understanding of the operation. "The children aren't being held at any of the main facilities," he reported, spreading building schematics across the dusty floor of what had once been the elevator's control room. "They're using a mobile system, moving small groups between safe houses throughout the day, then consolidating them only at the last moment before transport." This revelation changed everything about their approach. Instead of targeting fixed locations, they needed to track a dynamic system that could adapt and change in real time. It was brilliant from a security standpoint. If any single location was compromised, the rest of the network remained operational, but it also created an opportunity that neither of them had initially recognized. "If they're using mobile holding patterns," Natasha said, studying the facility layouts through binoculars, "then there's a moment of maximum vulnerability during the consolidation phase. They'll have to bring everyone to a single location before transport, and that's when they're most exposed." Working together, they began mapping what they called the convergence scenario, identifying the most likely assembly point based on logistics, security, and transportation access. The analysis pointed to Warehouse Complex D, a facility that had appeared inactive during her morning surveillance, but now showed subtle signs of preparation. Additional security lighting being installed, vehicles being pre-positioned, and most tellingly, the arrival of what appeared to be medical personnel. Medical personnel at a trafficking operation could mean many things, none of them good. At best, it suggested they were preparing to sedate the children for transport. At worst, it indicated something far more sinister: the kind of organ harvesting operations that turned missing children cases into homicides. The realization galvanized both operatives in a way that pure intelligence gathering hadn't. This wasn't just about documenting criminal activity anymore. It was about preventing atrocities that would haunt them for the rest of their lives if they failed to act. But acting required resources they didn't have, and skills neither of them had needed to develop during conventional intelligence operations. They needed to become something between law enforcement officers and military special operators, capable of conducting surveillance, gathering evidence, and potentially intervening directly if Romanian authorities couldn't respond quickly enough. The learning curve began with communication systems. Using equipment from her photographer's kit and components Volkov had acquired through his university contacts, they jury-rigged a surveillance network that could monitor multiple locations simultaneously while maintaining secure communication between their positions. It wasn't sophisticated by DIA standards, but it was invisible to the criminal network and sufficient for their immediate needs. Next came tactical positioning. The grain elevator provided excellent overview capability, but if the situation required direct intervention, they needed ground-level positions that offered both concealment and rapid access to the target facilities. Working backward from Warehouse Complex D, they identified 3 intermediate positions that could serve as staging areas for whatever action might be required. The most challenging learning curve involved Romanian law enforcement coordination. Volkov's contacts in the police force were reliable, but limited in authority. The kind of multi-facility raid they needed required coordination at levels far above local law enforcement. But requesting that level of support risked alerting corrupt officials who might be connected to the trafficking network. The solution came from an unexpected source: Volkov's background as an actual university professor before his recruitment into intelligence work. His academic credentials provided access to international law enforcement networks through research partnerships and academic conferences. Within hours, he'd made contact with Europol agents who had been tracking the same trafficking network from the Western European end of the pipeline. "They've been trying to infiltrate this organization for 8 months," Volkov reported during a brief communication window. "They have units positioned in Amsterdam, Hamburg, and Marseille, but they've never been able to identify the source operations. Our intelligence is the missing piece they need to coordinate simultaneous raids across multiple countries." This development transformed their mission from a 2-person surveillance operation into part of a multinational law enforcement action. But it also created new pressure. The European units were ready to move, but they needed precise timing and locations from the Romanian operation. Any mistake in intelligence gathering could compromise operations across 3 countries and alert the network to scatter permanently. As evening approached, the learning curve accelerated. Every hour brought new intelligence that refined their understanding of the trafficking operation, but also revealed additional complexity that tested their ability to adapt. The network wasn't just moving children within Romania, they were operating a hub-and-spoke system that distributed victims across Eastern and Western Europe based on specific orders from buyers in different countries. The documentation requirements alone were staggering. European law enforcement needed not just evidence of the trafficking operation, but proof of international commerce, specific identification of victims, and clear chains of custody that would hold up in courts across multiple jurisdictions. Every photograph, every recorded conversation, every piece of surveillance footage had to meet standards that neither Natasha nor Volkov had been trained to achieve. But perhaps the steepest learning curve involved something neither of them had anticipated: managing the emotional impact of what they were witnessing. Through telephoto lenses and electronic surveillance, they began documenting the preparation phases of the trafficking operation: vehicles being loaded with restraints, medical equipment that was clearly intended for sedation, and most heartbreakingly, glimpses of small figures being moved between locations under cover of darkness. Each piece of evidence they gathered represented a child whose life hung in the balance. Every technical achievement, a clearer photograph, a more precise location fix, a better communication intercept, brought them closer to potentially saving dozens of young lives, but it also brought them face to face with the reality of what would happen if they failed. By sunset, Natasha and Volkov had transformed themselves from intelligence operatives conducting routine surveillance into the central coordination point for an international law enforcement operation involving multiple countries, dozens of agents, and potentially hundreds of victims. They'd learned to operate equipment they'd never trained on, coordinate with agencies they'd never worked with, and manage responsibilities that far exceeded their original mission parameters. The most important thing they'd learned, however, was something about themselves. Under pressure that would have overwhelmed most people, they'd discovered capabilities they didn't know they possessed. More importantly, they'd discovered that when lives were at stake, the gap between what they knew how to do and what they needed to do could be bridged by determination, creativity, and the kind of focused intensity that comes from knowing failure isn't an option. As the final phase of preparation began, Both operatives understood that the learning curve was complete. Everything they would need to know, they now knew. Everything they would need to be able to do, they were now capable of doing. The question that remained was whether their newly acquired skills would be sufficient for what was coming next.
At 8:47 p.m., as purple twilight settled over Bucharest's industrial district, Natasha's secure satellite phone vibrated with the call that would change everything. The display showed an international number she didn't recognize, but the automated prefix indicated an emergency routing through DIA communications. Her first instinct was to ignore it. She was deep in surveillance mode, tracking the convergence of trafficking vehicles toward Warehouse Complex D, with Europol teams in 3 countries waiting for her intelligence to coordinate their raids. But something made her answer. Maybe it was the unusual routing protocol. Maybe it was the persistence. The phone had buzzed 3 times in rapid succession. Or maybe it was the mother's intuition that had been gnawing at her consciousness all day, despite her professional training to compartmentalize personal concerns during operations. "This is Sarah," she whispered, maintaining her cover identity even though the secure lines suggested official communication. "Ma'am, this is Nurse Jennifer Chen from St. Mary's Hospital in Phoenix, Arizona. We're trying to reach the emergency contact for Emma Snow. Are you her mother?" The words hit Natasha like a physical blow. Through her binoculars, she could see vehicles positioning themselves around the warehouse where dozens of trafficked children were about to be loaded for transport to destinations across Europe. In her earpiece, she could hear Agent Volkov providing real-time updates to Europol coordinators, and now, thousands of miles away, her own daughter was in a hospital emergency room, potentially dying, while her mother crouched on a rooftop thousands of miles away, unable to hold her hand or authorize treatment or even provide the medical information that might save her life. "What happened?" she managed, her voice barely audible as she ducked lower behind the grain elevator's concrete barrier. "Emma was brought in by ambulance about an hour ago. She collapsed at her neighbor's house, severe dehydration and what appears to be internal bleeding. We need to run immediate tests, but we're going to need family medical history and blood type compatibility for potential transfusion. We tried reaching your emergency contact, but..." The nurse's voice faded as the implications crashed over Natasha. Mrs. Patterson wasn't Emma's biological relative. Emma's medical records listed her biological father as unknown, and the only other family member with compatible blood type, Natasha's mother Linda, lived 3 hours away in rural Montana and had made it clear she wanted nothing to do with Natasha's dangerous lifestyle choices. I'm traveling overseas for work," Natasha said, the words feeling like betrayal even as she spoke them. "I can't get back immediately. Did you try contacting my mother, Linda Snow in Missoula?" "Yes, ma'am, we did. She said she wasn't available to help. Ma'am, I need to be direct with you. Emma's condition is serious. We need to know if you can authorize treatment decisions remotely, and we need medical history information right away." Through her binoculars, Natasha watched as the first transport van arrived at Warehouse Complex D. Inside that vehicle were children Emma's age being prepared for a journey that would end their childhoods forever. In 30 minutes, if everything went according to plan, coordinated raids across 4 countries would save dozens of young lives and dismantle a trafficking network that had operated with impunity for years. But Emma was in a hospital emergency room, potentially dying, while her mother crouched on a rooftop thousands of miles away, unable to hold her hand or authorize treatment or even provide the medical information that might save her life. "Nurse Chen, I need you to understand something. I'm currently in Romania on a classified government operation. I cannot leave my position, but I can provide any medical information you need remotely. Emma is type O negative, no known allergies, immunizations current as of 6 months ago. Her pediatrician is Dr. Sarah Martinez at Desert Children's Clinic." Even as she provided the clinical information, another part of her mind was calculating logistics. The earliest she could possibly reach Phoenix, assuming immediate evacuation and military transport, would be 18 hours.
But abandoning the surveillance position now would compromise not just the Romanian operation, but coordinated law enforcement actions across Europe that had been months in planning. "Ma'am," Nurse Chen continued, her voice gentler now, "I need to ask about the father. Emma's records show no paternal medical history, but genetic information could be crucial if we need bone marrow compatibility or—" "There is no father," Natasha interrupted, the words coming out harder than she intended. "I'm her only family. Do whatever you need to do to save her life and bill everything to my federal employee insurance. I'll sign authorizations remotely if necessary."
As she ended the call, Natasha found herself staring at the warehouse complex below with completely different eyes. Every child being loaded into those vehicles had a parent somewhere who would move heaven and earth to save them. Every family torn apart by trafficking had experienced exactly this moment, the terrible realization that love and determination weren't enough to bridge impossible distances or overcome overwhelming obstacles. The operational radio crackled in her earpiece. "Overwatch, this is Ground Team Alpha. We have visual confirmation of consolidation beginning. Estimate 12 to 15 children visible, ages approximately 6 to 14. Repeat, the convergence is beginning." Agent Volkov's voice followed immediately. "Europol Control. Romanian assets confirm primary target is active. Request immediate confirmation of coordination status from Hamburg, Amsterdam, and Marseille units." The responses came in rapid succession. European law enforcement teams positioned and ready, waiting only for Natasha's intelligence to provide precise timing for simultaneous raids. Everything they'd worked for over the past 48 hours was reaching its culmination, and she was the central coordination point for an operation that could save dozens of lives. But her satellite phone was already ringing again. This time it was Dr. Martinez, Emma's pediatrician, calling from the hospital where she'd rushed after receiving the emergency notification. "Natasha, where are you? Emma is asking for you, and we need to make some quick decisions about treatment options. Her condition has deteriorated since admission. We're looking at possible internal bleeding that may require surgical intervention." Surgery. 7-year-old Emma, who was afraid of needles during routine checkups, facing emergency surgery while her mother provided reconnaissance for a military-style operation on another continent. "Dr. Martinez, I'm in Romania on a classified assignment. I cannot leave my position. Please do whatever needs to be done to save my daughter's life. I trust your medical judgment completely." "Natasha, I understand your work is important, but Emma is asking why her grandmother won't come to see her. The nursing staff tried explaining that your mother is unavailable, but—" The conversation was interrupted by urgent communications from the surveillance operation. Through her binoculars, she could see that the trafficking operation wasn't proceeding as expected. Instead of the orderly consolidation they'd anticipated, there appeared to be some kind of emergency within the criminal network. Vehicles were arriving ahead of schedule. Additional personnel were being deployed. Most ominously, she could see what appeared to be accelerated loading procedures, the kind of rushed activity that suggested the traffickers had detected surveillance or received intelligence about potential law enforcement action. "Ground Team Alpha, be advised the timeline is accelerating. Recommend immediate transition to intervention posture. Repeat, recommend immediate intervention." Agent Volkov's voice was tense. "Overwatch. European units are not yet in position for coordinated action. Hamburg team estimates 20 minutes to deployment. Amsterdam unit is still en route to target location." The situation was deteriorating on multiple fronts simultaneously. In Phoenix, Emma was facing emergency surgery without her mother present. In Romania, the trafficking operation was accelerating beyond their ability to coordinate international response. And somewhere in the convergence of these crises, Natasha had to make decisions that would determine whether children lived or died, including her own. Her satellite phone rang a third time. The caller ID showed a number she recognized but hadn't seen in 2 years. Her mother's house in Missoula, Montana. Linda Snow's voice was exactly as cold as Natasha remembered. "I got a call from some hospital in Phoenix. They say Emma's hurt and needs blood. I want you to know that I'm not coming. That little girl is paying the price for your selfish choices, and I won't be part of cleaning up your mess."
The line went dead, leaving Natasha alone on a rooftop in Romania, watching trafficked children being loaded into vehicles while her own daughter lay in a hospital bed, abandoned by the only other family member who could help her. This was the test she'd never trained for, the moment when duty to strangers and love for family collided with such force that any choice felt like betrayal. In 30 seconds, she would have to decide whether to abandon the surveillance position that could save dozens of children or stay at her post while her daughter faced surgery alone.
For exactly 37 seconds, Natasha Snow stood frozen on the roof of the grain elevator, pulled between two impossible choices. Through her binoculars, she watched children being herded toward transport vehicles that would carry them into lives of unimaginable suffering. In her earpiece, Agent Volkov's increasingly urgent updates painted a picture of a law enforcement operation teetering on the edge of catastrophic failure. And in her mind, she could see Emma lying alone in a hospital bed, facing surgery without the one person who mattered most. Then something shifted. Not a decision exactly, but a recognition of what decision had already been made the moment she'd answered that first phone call from the hospital. "Volkov," she said into her radio, her voice steady for the first time in hours. "I need you to take primary observation and coordinate with European teams. I'm implementing Emergency Protocol Alpha 7. Protocol Alpha 7 was something that didn't officially exist, a contingency she'd developed during her years of balancing motherhood with classified operations. It was the plan for what to do when being a mother and being an operative became mutually exclusive, and she'd hoped she'd never need to use it. "Overwatch, negative on Protocol Alpha 7, Volkov responded immediately. "You are primary coordinator for international operation. European units are depending on your intelligence for synchronized timing." "Agent Volkov," she said into her radio, her voice carrying the authority of someone who just made a decision that couldn't be unmade. "In approximately 90 seconds, you're going to receive detailed intelligence packages on all 7 trafficking facilities, vehicle descriptions, personnel counts, and recommended tactical approaches. You will coordinate with Hamburg, Amsterdam, and Marseille units independently. I'm implementing emergency family evacuation." Even as she spoke, her fingers were flying across the secure tablet, uploading everything they'd gathered over the past 2 days to encrypted servers that Volkov could access independently. Floor plans, surveillance photos, communication intercepts, tactical assessments, everything European law enforcement would need to execute raids without her direct coordination. But the breakthrough wasn't in the tactical upload or the emergency protocol. It came when she opened a secure communication channel to Colonel Wright at Ramstein Air Base and said words she'd never imagined speaking during an active operation. "Command, this is Agent Snow. I am requesting immediate emergency evacuation for family medical crisis. I understand this may compromise current operation, but I need transportation to Phoenix within 12 hours. The silence on the secure channel lasted long enough for her to watch 2 more vehicles arrive at the warehouse complex below. When Colonel Wright finally responded, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd been expecting this call. "Snow, we've been monitoring the situation. Emergency transport is already being arranged. Military medical evacuation from Ramstein to Luke Air Force Base, then helicopter to Phoenix. But I need to ask, are you certain about this decision? The trafficking operation represents..." "Sir, with respect, this decision isn't about the trafficking operation anymore. Agent Volkov has all necessary intelligence to coordinate with European units. I've uploaded complete operational parameters to secured servers. But my daughter is facing emergency surgery and she needs her mother more than this operation needs me." The words carried a certainty that surprised even her. For years, she had operated under the assumption that her work protecting unknown children justified the risks to her relationship with Emma. But sitting on that rooftop, watching both crises unfold simultaneously, she'd realized something fundamental. She couldn't save other people's children by abandoning her own. The breakthrough accelerated as systems she'd put in place but never expected to use began activating. Within minutes, she received confirmation of emergency extraction. A DIA helicopter would pick her up from a medical facility 15 kilometers outside Bucharest within 2 hours. Military transport would have her at Ramstein Air Base by midnight. Emergency medical evacuation would put her in Phoenix before dawn. But the most important breakthrough was happening on the ground below. As she prepared to transfer primary coordination to Volkov, the trafficking
breaking operation began revealing vulnerabilities they hadn't anticipated. The accelerated timeline that had initially seemed like a disaster was actually forcing the criminal network to abandon security protocols that had protected them for months.
Instead of the careful, staggered movement between facilities they'd observed during surveillance, the traffickers were now consolidating everything at Warehouse Complex D in a single, massive operation. Every vehicle, every person, every piece of evidence was converging on one location, making them vulnerable to exactly the kind of coordinated raid that European law enforcement had been planning. Volkov, are you seeing what I'm seeing? She asked, adjusting her binoculars for maximum magnification. Affirmative. They're bringing everything together instead of maintaining distributed security. It's like they've decided to complete the entire operation in one location rather than risk extended exposure. Through her enhanced optics, Natasha could see something that changed the entire tactical picture. The medical personnel she'd observed earlier weren't preparing for organ harvesting or even routine sedation. They appeared to be treating injuries, providing medical care to children who'd obviously been suffering from neglect or abuse during captivity. This revelation transformed their understanding of the trafficking network's current state. Instead of a smoothly operating criminal enterprise, they were witnessing an organization under such pressure that they'd abandoned normal protocols and were now attempting to complete months of planned operations in a single evening. The intelligence implications were staggering. Every European law enforcement unit that had been tracking fragments of this network for months could now target the entire operation simultaneously. Instead of raids on multiple countries yielding partial results, they could potentially dismantle the complete network in coordinated strikes. European control, this is Romanian coordination. Volkov's voice carried new confidence as he assumed primary operational control. Intelligence indicates complete network consolidation at primary target. Recommend immediate deployment to all units to previously identified locations. Repeat, this is optimal tactical opportunity for complete network elimination. As responses came back from Hamburg, Amsterdam, and Marseille, confirming rapid deployment of tactical teams, Natasha felt something she hadn't expected: relief, not just about Emma's situation, but about the operation itself. By choosing to leave, she'd forced Volkov to assume responsibilities that brought out capabilities she hadn't known he possessed. The operation wasn't compromising, it was actually strengthening. Her secure satellite phone buzzed with an update from Dr. Martinez. Natasha, Emma is stabilizing. We've got her ready for surgery, but she's asking for you constantly. When can you be here? I'm en route, she replied, beginning to pack her surveillance equipment for rapid departure. Tell Emma that Mommy is coming home and that I love her more than all the stars in the sky. But the most unexpected breakthrough came through a communication channel she'd almost forgotten about. Her personal phone, the regular number that only family had access to, showed an incoming call from a Missoula, Montana area code. Linda Snow's voice was different this time. Not warm, but not cold either. Resigned, maybe? Or possibly something that might eventually become forgiveness. I'm driving to Phoenix, her mother said without preamble. I called the hospital and they told me what's happening with Emma. I don't approve of your choices and I still think you're being selfish, but that little girl shouldn't have to go through surgery alone. The words hit Natasha harder than any intelligence briefing or tactical assessment ever had. Her mother, who'd refused to acknowledge her career choices, who'd criticized her lifestyle, who'd hung up on hospital staff just hours earlier, was driving through the night to be with a granddaughter she barely knew because family, ultimately, mattered more than old arguments. Mom, she began, but Linda cut her off. Don't read too much into this. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for Emma. But Natasha, that little girl loves you. She talks about you constantly, about how proud she is that her mommy helps people. Maybe it's time you figured out that you can't help anyone if you lose yourself in the process.
As Natasha made final preparations for extraction, watching European law enforcement teams move into position for what would become one of the largest international trafficking raids in recent history, she realized that the breakthrough wasn't tactical or operational. It had been personal. For the first time in her career, she'd chosen being Emma's mother over being Agent Snow. And rather than destroying everything she'd worked for, that choice had somehow made everything else possible. The operation would succeed because she'd trusted Volkov enough to let him succeed. Emma would be okay because she'd recognized that being present mattered more than being perfect. And maybe, eventually, her family could heal because she'd finally admitted that some things were more important than any mission. The breakthrough was complete. Now came the hardest part: learning to live with the consequences of choosing love over duty, even when both mattered more than life itself.
The Romanian military helicopter lifted off from the medical facility outside Bucharest at 11:23 p.m. local time, carrying Natasha Snow away from the most important operation of her career and toward the most important moment of her life as a mother. But as the lights of the city fell away below, she wasn't thinking about what she was leaving behind. She was focused entirely on what lay ahead, and the series of precisely timed connections that would determine whether she reached Phoenix before Emma went into surgery. The acceleration began immediately. Instead of the standard military transport protocol she'd expected, emergency medical evacuation procedures had been activated at the highest levels. Colonel Wright's voice came through the helicopter's communication system with updates that revealed the full scope of what had been set in motion by her decision to leave Romania. Snow, your extraction has been classified as Priority Alpha Medical Emergency. We've got a C-130 medical transport standing by at Ramstein with full surgical capability if needed during transit. Flight time to Luke Air Force Base is 7 hours, then immediate helicopter transfer to Phoenix. You should be at St. Mary's Hospital by 0600 local time. But the real acceleration was happening in the intelligence networks she'd left behind. Through encrypted communication channels that kept her connected to the Romanian operation, even while racing toward Phoenix, she could monitor the success of the transition she'd initiated. Agent Volkov wasn't just maintaining the operation, he was executing it better than she could have managed from her rooftop position. European control, Romanian coordination, reporting, complete network mapping achieved. His voice came through with confidence that hadn't been there 12 hours earlier. All 7 facilities identified, personnel counts confirmed, transport vehicles tracked. Hamburg, Amsterdam, and Marseille units have optimal tactical positioning for synchronized deployment. The intelligence was flowing in real time, and it painted a picture of an operation that had transformed from desperate improvisation into precision law enforcement. The trafficking network's decision to consolidate everything at Warehouse Complex D had created exactly the vulnerability that European authorities needed to dismantle the entire organization simultaneously. As the helicopter crossed into German airspace, Natasha received an update that showed just how much the operational dynamics had changed. Europol had identified the trafficking network as part of a larger criminal enterprise that had been operating across 6 countries for more than 3 years. The intelligence she and Volkov had gathered wasn't just enabling one raid, it was providing the foundation for dismantling an international organization that had moved more than 400 children during its existence. The medical transport at Ramstein Air Base was unlike anything Natasha had ever seen. The C-130 had been configured as a flying intensive care unit, complete with surgical capability, blood bank, and communication systems that could coordinate with hospitals anywhere in the world. As they lifted off for the transatlantic crossing, she found herself connected not just to the ongoing Romanian operation, but to Dr. Martinez and the surgical team preparing for Emma's operation in Phoenix. Natasha, Emma's doing better than we hoped, Dr. Martinez's voice came through the aircraft's communication system with clarity that made the distance seem irrelevant. We've stabilized the internal bleeding, and her blood pressure is responding well to treatment. We're still planning surgery, but it's no longer emergency status. We can wait for you to arrive. The relief was overwhelming, but it was immediately followed by another wave of information from Europe that showed the acceleration continuing on multiple fronts. The Romanian operation had expanded beyond anything they had originally planned. Instead of simple trafficking documentation, they'd uncovered financial networks, corruption systems, and international transportation routes that connected criminal organizations across half of Europe. Snow, Colonel Wright's voice carried a tone she'd never heard before, something between amazement and concern. The intelligence you gathered is being classified as one of the most significant trafficking network discoveries in the past decade. The European raids are being expanded to include banking institutions, government officials, and transportation companies. They're estimating more than 200 arrests across 4 countries.
But the most significant acceleration was happening in Phoenix, where systems Natasha had never imagined began falling into place. Her mother had arrived at St. Mary's Hospital at 2:17 a.m. after driving nonstop from Montana. More remarkably, she'd not only provided the blood compatibility Emma needed, but had also begun coordinating with Dr. Martinez to ensure that Emma's medical care continued seamlessly, whether Natasha made it back in time or not. "Your mother is formidable," Dr. Martinez reported during a mid-flight consultation. "She's provided complete family medical history, arranged for Emma's school to be notified about the medical situation, and somehow managed to contact Mrs. Patterson to ensure continuity of care arrangements. She's also spent the past 3 hours reading to Emma and helping her practice her butterfly presentation." The butterfly presentation. In the midst of international trafficking raids and emergency medical evacuations, Emma was still a 7-year-old who'd worked hard on a school project about butterflies and wanted her mother to be proud of her academic achievement. The juxtaposition was almost surreal. While Natasha raced across the Atlantic at 40,000 feet, coordinating with European law enforcement operations that were saving dozens of children, her own daughter was rehearsing facts about monarch migration patterns with the grandmother who drove through the night to help her. The European operation reached its climax while Natasha was somewhere over the North Atlantic. Through encrypted communication channels, she monitored the synchronized raids that began at exactly 3 a.m. European time. Hamburg units moved on financial operations that had been laundering trafficking proceeds through legitimate businesses. Amsterdam teams targeted transportation networks that had been moving children between countries under cover of legitimate cargo operations. Marseille forces focused on the Western European distribution points where trafficked children were delivered to buyers. But the center of it all remained Warehouse Complex D in Bucharest, where Volkov coordinated with Romanian special police units to execute the raid that would define the success of the entire operation. Natasha found herself listening to real-time updates of an operation she'd helped plan, but couldn't participate in, watching from thousands of miles away as months of intelligence work culminated in direct action. "Romanian coordination, European control," came the transmission at 3:47 a.m. European time. "Primary facility secured. Initial count shows 28 children recovered, ages 6 to 15. Medical teams are providing immediate care, but preliminary assessment indicates all subjects are alive and responsive." 28 children. Not the 30 they'd estimated, but 28 young lives that would go home to families instead of disappearing forever into criminal networks. As Natasha listened to the continuing reports, additional facilities secured, transportation networks disrupted, key personnel arrested, she realized that leaving Romania had enabled something larger than she could have achieved by staying. The acceleration continued as the C-130 approached Luke Air Force Base. Intelligence updates showed that the European raids had exceeded all expectations. More than 180 arrests across 4 countries, 7 separate trafficking operations disrupted. Most importantly, more than 60 children recovered from various stages of the trafficking pipeline. Some who'd been missing for months, others who'd been intercepted before they could disappear completely. But the personal acceleration was just as dramatic. Through medical communications that connected the aircraft to Phoenix hospitals, Natasha could monitor not just Emma's improving condition, but the developing relationship between Emma and her grandmother. Linda Snow was reading medical charts, asking intelligent questions about treatment options, and somehow managing to be both the authoritative family advocate Emma needed and the supportive presence that kept a frightened 7-year-old calm during a medical crisis. "Mommy,"
Emma's voice came through the communication system as they began descent into Arizona airspace. "Grandma Linda says you're helping other kids who are in trouble. She says that's why you had to stay away, but that you're coming home now to take care of me." The simple statement contained more understanding than most adults achieved about the complexities of balancing duty and family. Emma wasn't angry about her mother's absence. She was proud of what her mother was doing and confident that she would always come home when truly needed. As the helicopter touched down at St. Mary's Hospital at 6:12 a.m. Phoenix time, Natasha understood that the acceleration hadn't just been about transportation logistics or operational coordination. Everything in her life had been building toward this moment. The convergence of her identity as an intelligence operative and her identity as a mother. The reconciliation of duty to strangers and love for family. The realization that choosing one didn't require abandoning the other. The acceleration was complete. What remained was learning to live with the momentum it had created and the new possibilities it had revealed about who she could become.
Natasha Snow walked through the automatic doors of St. Mary's Hospital at 6:18 a.m., still wearing the tactical clothing she'd put on in Romania 36 hours earlier, carrying nothing but a secure satellite phone and the kind of exhaustion that comes from crossing continents while coordinating international law enforcement operations. But as she stepped into the pediatric wing and saw her mother sitting in the family waiting area, with Emma curled up asleep in her lap, she knew that everything had changed, not just in the past 2 days, but permanently. Linda Snow looked up as her daughter approached, and for the first time in years, there was no judgment in her eyes. Just the kind of recognition that passes between two women who'd both spent a sleepless night protecting the same child. "She's been waiting for you," Linda said softly, stroking Emma's hair. "The doctors postponed the surgery until you arrived. They said her condition stabilized enough to wait, and she insisted that Mommy needed to be here." Emma stirred at the sound of voices and opened her eyes to see her mother standing there. The smile that spread across her face was worth every mile Natasha had traveled, every difficult decision she'd made, every moment of doubt she'd experienced about whether she was doing the right thing. "Mommy!" Emma sat up carefully, mindful of the ivy line in her arm. "Grandma Linda told me about the children you helped save. She showed me on the map where Romania is, and we calculated how fast you had to travel to get here. You flew almost as fast as the monarch butterflies during migration." The butterfly presentation. Even facing surgery, Emma had been thinking about her school project, finding ways to connect her mother's work with the academic achievement she was most proud of. It was such a perfectly Emma thing to do, finding wonder and connection even in the midst of medical crisis. "Dr. Martinez says the surgery isn't scary anymore. They just need to fix a small problem inside, and then I'll be completely better. But Grandma Linda says she's going to stay until I'm all better, and maybe she can come to my butterfly presentation too." The transformation was already visible, not just in Emma's improved medical condition, but in the relationship that had developed between grandmother and granddaughter during the long night of waiting. Linda had driven from Montana, expecting to fulfill a grim family obligation, but somewhere during those hours of reading stories and answering questions about butterflies, she'd rediscovered something she'd forgotten about: the joy of being needed by someone who loved unconditionally. Dr. Martinez appeared with the surgical team shortly after, her expression carrying the kind of professional optimism that meant genuinely good news. "The internal bleeding has completely stopped and all her vital signs are excellent. We're looking at a minor laparoscopic procedure, maybe 90 minutes, minimal recovery time. Emma should be back to normal activities within a week." As they prepared Emma for surgery, Natasha found herself able to be completely present in a way that had been impossible during her previous experiences balancing motherhood and operational duty. There were no classified briefings demanding her attention, no secure communications requiring immediate response. For the first time in years, she was simply Emma's mother, holding her hand and making promises she knew she could keep. "Will you be here when I wake up?" Emma asked as the surgical team prepared to take her to the operating room. "I will be right here. And so will Grandma Linda. And when you're feeling better, we're going to work on your butterfly presentation together."
But the most profound transformation was happening in the conversation that followed between Natasha and her mother as they waited during Emma's surgery. For the first time since Natasha had joined the military 10 years earlier, they talked honestly about the choices they'd both made and the costs they'd both paid. "I was wrong about some things," Linda admitted, staring out the hospital window at the Phoenix sunrise. "I thought your work was just an excuse to avoid being a real mother, but watching Emma talk about you, seeing how proud she is of what you do, I realized she understands something I didn't. She knows you save other people's children because you love her, not despite loving her." The insight was more profound than any intelligence analysis Natasha had ever conducted. Emma had understood intuitively what it had taken Natasha years to learn, that protecting other families and protecting her own family weren't competing priorities. They were complementary expressions of the same fundamental commitment to ensuring that children grew up safe and loved. During Emma's surgery, Natasha received final updates from the European operation that revealed the complete scope of what had been accomplished. The trafficking network they'd targeted had been part of an international criminal enterprise that had operated across 8 countries for more than 4 years. The intelligence gathered during her 2 days in Romania enabled coordinated law enforcement actions that recovered 127 children, arrested more than 200 individuals, and disrupted criminal operations valued at more than 50 million euros.
But perhaps more importantly, the operational success had demonstrated something that would reshape how international law enforcement approached complex criminal networks. The combination of on-ground intelligence gathering with real-time international coordination had proven more effective than any previous anti-trafficking strategy. Agencies across Europe were already requesting briefings on the techniques that had made such comprehensive success possible. Agent Volkov called as Emma was being moved to recovery, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd exceeded every expectation placed on him. "Snow, I wanted to give you the final numbers. 28 children recovered from the primary facility, but the coordinated raids across Europe brought the total to 127. More importantly, we've identified placement locations for children who'd been trafficked over the past 2 years. Reunification efforts are already beginning." 127 children going home to families who'd thought they were lost forever. It was the kind of success that justified every sacrifice Natasha had made during her career, every moment she'd spent away from Emma, every difficult choice she'd made about balancing duty and family. But the real transformation was visible when Emma woke up from surgery. Instead of the grogginess and discomfort that typically follow medical procedures, she was alert and excited, eager to show her mother and grandmother the get well cards that Mrs. Patterson had delivered from her entire second-grade class. "Look, Mommy," she said, spreading the cards across her hospital bed. "Everyone at school thinks it's really cool that my mom is a secret agent who saves kids. Tommy Martinez said his mom told him that you're like a real-life superhero, except instead of fighting bad guys with lasers, you fight them with your brain." The description was surprisingly accurate, and it revealed something important about how Emma processed her mother's work. She wasn't resentful of the time and attention that Natasha's job required. She was proud of having a mother whose job was protecting other children, and she understood that the skills and commitment required for that work were what made her mother capable of protecting her as well. 3 days later, when Emma was discharged from the hospital with a clean bill of health, the transformation in the Snow family was complete, but still evolving. Linda had extended her visit to attend Emma's butterfly presentation, which had been rescheduled to accommodate Emma's recovery. More significantly, she'd begun talking about relocating to Phoenix to be closer to her granddaughter, not to supervise Natasha's parenting, but to be part of a family that she'd finally learned to understand. Emma's butterfly presentation was everything she'd hoped it would be. Standing in front of her second-grade class, she explained monarch migration patterns with the kind of scientific precision that her teacher beamed with pride. But she concluded with something that hadn't been in her original presentation, a comparison between monarch butterflies and her mother's work. "Monarch butterflies travel thousands of miles to protect their families," Emma explained to her classmates. "My mommy travels thousands of miles to protect other people's families.
They both do really important jobs that help make sure kids are safe. After the presentation, as they drove home together, Natasha, Emma, and Linda, the conversation turned to the future. Emma wanted to know if her mother would still have to travel for work. Linda wanted to know if Natasha had considered requesting assignments closer to home. Both questions reflected the same underlying concern: how to maintain the new family dynamic they'd created without sacrificing the professional identity that had made it possible. "I think," Natasha said, "there might be ways to do both. The success we had in Romania showed that remote coordination can be just as effective as being on the ground. Maybe it's time to explore what intelligence work looks like when you don't have to choose between being a good operative and being a good mother." 6 months later, Natasha Snow was promoted to Senior Intelligence Coordinator for International Operations, a position that allowed her to lead complex international cases from a permanent base in Phoenix. Agent Volkov had been promoted to European Liaison, coordinating directly with her on cases that required international cooperation. The techniques they'd developed during the Romanian operation had been adopted as standard protocol for anti-trafficking operations worldwide. But the most important transformation was visible every morning when Emma got ready for school. She still braided her hair the same way, still packed her backpack with the same careful attention to organization, but now she did it while telling her mother about her homework, secure in the knowledge that Mommy would be there for breakfast, would be available for school events, and would always come home at the end of the day. The secret operation had ended. The real life had begun, and it was better than anything Natasha had ever imagined possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.